everyone? Really? Great, fantastic. Hi, so I'm Etinosa Emokpae. I work at Skirnick Wine and Spirits in my day job, but in other things I do all other kinds of things. But yeah, I have the immense pleasure and honor to moderate this panel today that is on empowering the buyer. And for me, having been here last year, almost a year to the day, it's really exciting to see like where hybrid wines and non-vitis vinifera wines have gone to the point where now we're having a conversation of how we can provide the tools for buyers, whether you're in retail, restaurants, whatever you're doing, that we're able to kind of provide context and with sharing with these people today. They're going to share their stories in terms of what they've been doing over the past year in navigating this world that we're essentially building. So yeah. So I will do a brief intro to everyone here. We have Christy Frank, who really needs no introduction, but owner of Copake Wine Works. Also Hamlet Town. If you've not tried the Hamlet Town cocktails in a can, you need to because they're fantastic. Also writer, and also just a friend and mentor to all of us here. Really an honor to be on a panel with you today. Then we have Elaine Heide as well. And I'm just going to read yours because I want to do justice. So Elaine has worked in wine for 20 years and has held a wide variety of roles in the industry. She currently resides in Willamette Valley, where she runs the wine program for a boutique hotel and the beverage program for an independent restaurant and bar. Elaine is also on the board of Our Legacy Harvested, a non-profit dedicated to empowering and advancing BIPOC individuals in the wine industry. Super pumped to have you here today. Also really glad to call you friend. And also Emily, last but not least, Gutierrez, who is now running the beverage director of Ruffian, Eastern European National Wine Bar located in the East Village. If you didn't know, I'm sure you all know, it's fantastic. But yeah, thank you all for being here today. So we're just gonna jump right into it because I think the way that I've kind of laid this out was kind of probably to start with not necessarily the negative aspects of what you guys are doing, but like the challenges, right? Because when you think about trying to kind of educate and wrap your head around how do I talk about these wines in a way, what is the language that I use to describe, hybrid wines? What does that mean? Because it has so many negative connotations in the market right now, or it has been for honestly forever. So the first question is essentially, what are the hurdles, I guess, you all experience in terms of selling wine, whether it be retail in your respective markets and worlds and things. Who wants to, you want to start, Christy? Yes.
Am I on? All right.
You're on.
So I definitely come to it from the retail standpoint. Can you hear me? All right, there we go. I come to it from a retail perspective. So most of the selling that I do for these wines are in a wine shop. However, I also do some teaching for the WSET. So that's kind of a place where I'm able to, a lot of these grapes and a lot of these places and these techniques aren't necessarily part of the syllabus. So I'm constantly finding ways just to mention them, stepping aside from the syllabus and then going into the syllabus to say, you don't really need to know this, but you should know this in the real world. But jumping back into the retail standpoint, I think one of the challenges would be, and it's kind of a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. A lot of people just don't know what these grapes are. So in some cases, depending on who I'm talking to, you don't even need to mention that they're hybrids or non-vinifera or that they're co-fermentations. They're just, for many people, they're just wine. For people who kind of come to it from this sort of place of a formal education, that's where there might be a little bit more of a backlash isn't the right word, but just sort of like, well, what are these? I haven't heard of these, in which case then it's just kind of I'll use it as an opportunity to remind people that these are agricultural products. Let's talk about why people are using these particular grape varieties and just have it as a way to get into that conversation for people who want it. Some people just don't, they just want a good bottle of wine.
Sure. Well, to you, Emily, I mean, I know in terms of you running the program at Ruffian and honestly being such I think a champion of these wines and these producers. I mean, how has it been for you in terms of like, you know, being consumer facing in terms of a restaurant, dealing, well, also I would say twofold, right, with educating your staff, but also educating your customer, your guests that come in.
Yeah, I would say already at Ruffian, I'm asking people to be very vulnerable. It's a list that's not very intuitive to a lot of folks. It certainly wasn't intuitive when I came on. So within that space, thank you. Within that space, there's a lot of vulnerability that you're asking people to engage in. There's a lot of things that you might not be able to pronounce. There might be things that you don't have your own connection to. So there's always this kind of moment of kind of stepping up and stepping back at the same time and releasing yourself to the experience. And so a lot of times my staff thinks I'm a broken record, but I'll say to folks like, we can be scared together. It's gonna be okay. We'll find something and we'll find a way to connect this to you. But within that, I think there's a lot of fear. And I think also within that space, it's really hard to ask someone to release something that they've thought of as a truth, right? So I think a lot of times people have these preconceived notions of what hybrid grapes are going to denote or what these co-ferments are going to denote. And let's be realistic, a lot of it isn't necessarily the most positive, right? So you're asking someone to say, I know that that was your experience and I understand that that might be your truth, but we've evolved and there's always information that's evolving. And I think it kind of becomes twofold, right? Some of it is access. Maybe I don't know that things have changed. So the experience I had with this wine 10 years ago, I'm holding on to that here. I'm really asking you to release that. That's a big ask, right? And then there's also access, right? Not everyone has access to the fact that this has changed. Not everyone has access to trying these in their new kind of iteration. But also within that, not everyone has the desire, and that's also totally okay. So I think what you're trying to do is champion something that has always been known, but what you're asking people to do is to unlearn something. Sorry. You're asking them to unlearn and relearn at the same time, and that's athletic. That requires a certain athleticism, that requires a certain amount of humility. But it's an adventure that we can all engage with together. And I think that's the part of the exchange, that's the part of the community building, that's what's exciting. And also these are places that if you're indigenous to Turtle Island, if you are living on Turtle Island, you've experienced this agriculture. You might not know that you have, so unlearn with me, and then let's relearn together. And that's creating new synapses, and that's creating new connections. And that's our own little mushroom network of information, right? So I don't know if I answered the question, but
You answered it incredibly. No, I mean, it's an yes, no, that's perfect. Yes, I love that. I think for me, I think what's beautiful about that is that the fact that the first thing that you said of you're asking people to be vulnerable, right? Because it's not something that you traditionally think about vulnerability in terms of going to a restaurant, but really just giving up control in the way of being hey, let me guide you in this way. In which I know when I go to restaurants, that's kind of I don't want to think about anything. I want to be taken on a journey, and I think that that's a beautiful way to approach kind of guiding people into these wines that don't have any context for them. But I do want to touch with you, Elaine, because I think it's I think it's easy, right? We're on the East Coast, like especially being in New York, where I think it's like where a lot of things are, I think, well, me being in Philadelphia, where these wines, it's still like an uphill battle to sell many things. But I think thinking about New York, where it's like, people are used to change, people are used to newer things. I wonder if, from a regional standpoint, you being in Willamette Valley, what has been your experience in terms of talking to guests? Are people more open? Has it been easier? Has it been hard? I'm imagining it's a challenge.
Yeah.
We're talking about challenges right now, but
Yeah. So, yes, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to even just sell wine from California in the Willamette Valley because the local market is so strong there, and there's, it has its own just compelling kind of draw for consumers and for professional buyers. And so, but thinking outside of that, my experience in recent history, specifically in the Willamette Valley, has been that it's the same as everywhere, where people kind of have these preconceived ideas of what they like and what they don't like, and you have a hard time consumer-wise trying to break down those barriers like you're talking about and saying, don't be afraid of this, you may have had this in the past, try it again with me. And when you work in a restaurant setting, it's fantastic. You can pair those things with food, and that's to your advantage greatly. But as a buyer, it's also an investment, because sometimes you have to open a bottle just to share it with someone, just to get them to try it. So you're doing them this huge favor. You're investing in them trying this thing, hoping that you change their mind about it. And I'm speaking of sake or like a Riesling pear co-fermentation. There are some nice things being made in the area outside of vinifera, but even though they're local, it's still hard to get through to those consumers that really just want Pinot Noir on the table. And so it's a fun challenge, though. And honestly, like, the thing I think about all the time is these days, it kind of reminds me of selling Riesling, because Riesling in itself, I mean, we all agree, it's incredibly important. It's incredibly special. It's globally known, but it's still... It still can be a challenge even to get that consumer at a table with their dinner to order Riesling. So this is a challenge that you have to enjoy if you're working as a sommelier, if you're working as a retailer. And when you're talking about alternative fermentations, I think that where I am is in a really special place because people are open to local production. So I feel like part of my job as a buyer in that area for both retail and restaurants is to ask producers to expand what they're making. So one of the questions I ask every grower that I go out and visit now is, have you thought about hybrids? Do you know anyone growing hybrids in this area? Because everyone talks about disease pressure. Everyone talks about their spray program. And the Willamette Valley is really well known for having a lot of sustainable growing practices, whether they're certified or not. And people, I mean, the number of people that farm sustainably, and they do as little as they can, not just from a financial standpoint and a health and safety standpoint, but because they really do want to honor the land that they have. However, they still are not considering hybrid. They're still not considering grape varieties that they actually don't even have to spray at all. And so I think as a buyer, it's really important to ask those questions to growers and to consumers. So in both directions, you just have to create the demand for the product that you want to see.
Lovely. No, that's fantastic. And now I think that's a great jumping point now, because we've talked about the challenges, but I think, let's talk about the things that have been very successful for you in terms of, in your programs and what you've been doing, like things that have worked. And I already see you got the mic, you're ready to go. Christy, I'm gonna start with you.
Okay. I mean, it's a really simple thing, just where we're putting them on the shelf. So we don't have and so my wine shop is up in Copake, which, who here knows where Copake is? Ooh, look at that. A handful of people. I say it's in the center of everything, in the middle of nowhere. And we get, especially during the summer, we do get a lot of people coming in who are there for the week or there for the weekend. And a lot of people will be asking for local wine. Well, we take a pretty broad view as to what's local wine and kind of consider everything from like the Hudson Valley to the Finger Lakes on up. And we'll even use that as a kind of a jumping off point to talk about East Coast wines in general. And so we don't have a hybrid section. We'll have maybe a skin contact section, an orange wine section, an East Coast section, a New York section, and we'll just put these wines next to wines that come from vinifera, from anything else, and it oops, is that me?
Yeah.
I'm vibrating. And it's a good way to force the conversation, because you're walking along and you're talking about this wine, and oh, this one happens to be a co-ferment of apples and grapes because we're in the Hudson Valley, and it's actually a lot easier to grow apples here than it is most grapes. So if you want something local, you need to explore these things.
No, I think that's great when you think about, you're putting them all, grouping them together, like, because I think, right, like, wouldn't it be, I mean, it's not weird, I've seen it before where people are starting to have like, oh, this is our hybrid section, and where I feel like sometimes that can almost alienate people in a way, because they're like, oh, well, I see that that's a hybrid, I'm staying away from that. But I think by grouping them in, because they are a part of the conversation with vinifera wines, I think that is a great way for just people just in their minds thinking like, oh, these are all together, or we're thinking about East Coast wine together, like, or West Coast, wherever it's coming from. This is in the same context as vinifera wine is. So yeah, no, I think that's great. Well, I do want to say for Emily, because I think too, like, granted, this is the first time I'm officially meeting you, but I've heard so many wonderful things about, like, well, really about, like, how the language that you use in terms of describing wines, of describing these wines in particular. I just would love for you to touch more on that in terms of, you know, what you've done and how you've opened people up to embracing these wines just by the use of your words.
Yeah, I love this question. I think what's most important is, like, these wines fucking slap. Like, they're so delicious. And at the end of the day, like, if that's our baseline, we're successful, right? So when I first tried these wines, I didn't have to ask many questions because my baseline was satisfied, right? However, then pitching them to certain people, I'm a Central and Eastern European wine bar. The climate crisis is crisising. We can't continue talking about this type of program without talking about this. So it actually happened, no pun intended, but pretty organically. You know, I was focusing my program on Fashion Week. And so when I thought of Fashion Week, I was thinking about, like, classic expressions, classic silhouettes, but also fashion to me was so tied to futurisms. So all of a sudden I was tasting a lot of these PV varietals, and my baseline was met. It was delicious, but also I'm able to champion these people who are doing the most that they can to be responsible stewards of their land. And so if they're going to continue to produce successfully, this is the pivot that they have to make. And for them, it's not really a pivot, it's just a responsibility. So within that, I said to my boss man, listen, I know I never deviate from Central and Eastern Europe, but this, to me, it's happening in Austria. That can be our cornerstone, but also I'm gonna bring shit in from New Jersey. I'm gonna do it. But I think your original question was, like, how do you make that accessible to folks? And I think that wine is such a multi-sensory experience. It's not necessarily about what you're smelling. It's not necessarily about what you're tasting. Maybe it's a song that comes to mind. Maybe it's a pop culture figure that you're associating with this. Maybe it's a shape or a I don't know, maybe I'm just neurodivergent as fuck, but, like, there's so many different ways that you can intuit the spirit and the essence of the wine. So with my wine list, I'm already, like I said, asking people to be pretty vulnerable. So when we curate our list, every single wine has a description that accompanies it. But I really don't like to talk about the tasting notes that you're gonna get. I really try to stay away from putting that seed in someone's mind, because we all come from such very different perspectives that I don't want to necessarily alienate you. I want to welcome you. I might be challenging you ever so slightly, but really what I'm asking is for you to exchange with me as well. So when I describe these wines, most of the time I'm gonna say, it's giving Grace Kelly elegance, it's giving, or whatever the case may be, right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, I saw her in that movie, or I know who Helena Bonham Carter is. So when I say this wine is like drinking the blood of your enemies, and that you would toast this to Tim Burton or something, that's placing it in a way that suddenly makes it a lot more accessible. But also to Christy's point and to your point as well, not necessarily isolating them so that they are in their own section. I pepper them throughout the list, so you'll see it next to Jura, right? You'll see it and you won't even have to really think about it. We have a tasting menu that comes with pairings. You bet I'm gonna slide some of those in without telling you that that's what it is. But it's a conversation point, because really I think with my program, what I'm trying to do is not necessarily sell you wine, I'm trying to tell you a story. I'm trying to make this an engagement. I'm trying to make this an experience that is almost multidisciplinary in that way. And so here's a taste. What is it giving to you? But at least I've led you to an expectation. And if it lands, it lands. And if it doesn't, I love that too, because really bad relationships you learn from, right? So if you hate it, I actually love that, because then I can find you something that you love. Polarity sometimes can be really helpful. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's great in the sense of thinking about because I always think too is that you learn so much from the things that you don't like, and being able to embrace that and that being okay. Everything's not going to be a hit, but I think wow, I just love that. Now, Elaine, you work now. You're in a hotel, spa, a resort, if you will, kind of, but a cool luxury hotel. So I know of the brief time that I spent in terms of working in hotels. The clientele is lots of fun. Right. They're great. They're fantastic. But I mean, I have so many questions for you in terms of how do you bring, how do you push people like that in a way to be a little bit more adventurous and a little bit more we don't need just Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
So it's a combination of two things. Both of them touch on things that you both said. So one of them is sort of hiding everything in plain sight.
Yeah.
So adding it to the list into sections in a way that normalize all of these different fermentations. And I will fully admit that I am not doing this yet. I've been in the role as wine director of this boutique luxury hotel and spa since May 1st. And so when I started, I sort of reimagined what that position was going to look like for the business, and it stands on 3 pillars. And I made this very clear to the general manager of the property. I said, we stand on the pillar of community, inclusivity, and education. And so with those things, I feel creating a list that has more diversity that goes outside of Pinot Noir 100% supports those things. But the big one for me is community. This is why I pointed out that I'm asking growers to consider these different things. And when they do, I reward them with a lot of attention, a lot of questions, and then trying to promote those things. For example, Kelly Fox and Jim Anderson collaborate. They're partners, not in business, but in life partners. And they both helm different wineries. Jim Anderson from Patricia Green Cellars, Kelly Fox for her own namesake winery. So they collaborated last year on a blueberry wine. So it's Oregon blueberries. They approached the production in the same way that they make Pinot Noir. So maceration, natural fermentation, maturation in neutral French oak. And the wine is beautiful, and it is going on the tasting menu at the Allison, because this is the other part. So hiding things in plain sight, but then also using the tasting menu as a tool. And I cannot wait to pair that blueberry wine with venison. And so I'm really excited for that. And so I'm emailing both of them. I'm saying, tell me more about the wine. Tell me how you made it. Are you making it again? Please keep going. I want to buy more. And yes, they're making it again. I was really glad to hear. But so it's offering support to the producers and then feeding it to consumers as often as possible. At the other place that I work, which is I run the beverage program for a smaller independent restaurant. Used to be a retailer also. Tasting menus was a really great tool that I used there for fruit fermentations and rice fermentations, because I got to just have, the same thing. You use it as a tool and you use it to just get things in front of people, and especially exciting when you get to pair them with food and people sit down for that tasting menu and they're just so open.
What was your favorite?
Oh, the other place is Mac Market.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha. But what was your favorite in terms of like pairings?
Oh,
like,
my
what was
favorite.
Not to put you on the spot.
Right. So the chef at Mac Market did some crudo last year, a couple different crudo dishes that were, one was a little spicy, one was not. And definitely pairing that with rice ferments was really fun. But it was kind of funny because I feel like, aren't we all in a place where we can be open to having sake with raw fish? Like, come on, that's so simple, right? Like, I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't inventing anything. But I still had pushback, even from people who I thought were open-minded beverage professionals. They were still like, oh, I don't really like sake. I'm so sorry for you. But please just try this. So.
I mean, yeah, I think, well, that's the wonderful thing, right? I think I've heard a lot in terms of like using tasting menus, and I know like when I was running programs, I mean, that was literally my primary tool of like, listen, put on my list here, yeah, you want your sound share, you're gonna pay for it, you're gonna pay for those big bottles, but like, really, if you're really here to experience something, to be taken on a journey, it's like, yeah, like, this is like the tool, this is the way that I can open up things, because I think a lot of times, like, I think for all of us, I could say, like, a lot of my, like, wine aha moments came through food pairings, in a lot of ways, being like, oh my God, like, what? I didn't know that married so well together, and I think that, these wines, and, alternate fermentations, like, these they're so versatile with food, in so many ways. It's like, I think your brain can explode with how many really creative ways that you can showcase these beverages. So yeah, I love hearing that. All right, so moving on to like kind of like, because we've been talking a lot about language in particular, it's like my kind of like final question for the panel is like kind of like more philosophical, because I think, a lot of us, I think we all veer on the side of like where, WSET and like master, you can still go through master line, right? No, but yeah. But I mean, and then also like being very creatively, minded and given. But like, I don't know if you did any of like the certifications or anything like that. Yeah, we all dabbled. But I think I think what's so important about like what is being built now before our very eyes is like really like language. How do we talk about it? And I think like, usually it's like, do we rely on like what already exists, right? And like the usual thing is like, oh yeah, like Marquette, very similar to Pinot Noir, I've heard that, or things like that. Like, do we rely on these like existing wines that we already have, or should we be moving towards building a new language, a new way to think about these wines without, without us having to revert back, I guess, to a dying system.
I think it's a little bit of both, right? Because sometimes the best movement is the slowest movement, in a sense. I don't think we can rush this process, because I think we have to establish a core foundation of trust. So I think if we pivot too greatly, you risk ostracizing some folks. So I think I can only speak from my own experience. So at Ruffian, for instance, I'm constantly engaging in what I say is the gentle no but, right? People are coming in and they're saying, oh, I want Chablis. Well, no, but I have this wine from Corsica that's going to express itself in this way and that way, and let's try it. And maybe you found a new favorite. So it's connecting dots and finding out what people's frame of reference is. So is that doing a service? Yes, but to your point, is it also doing a disservice? Because we are trying to constantly push this conversation forward. So what I've been talking about with my staff is that I don't really want to use the quote unquote classic regions as my cornerstones, because like we're really invested in telling the story of the origins of wine. We're really focused on the Levant and the Caucasus. And so I think that by constantly using, let's say, Chablis as my frame of reference, I'm actually reinvesting in a system that I'm actively trying to dismantle. So if I can push my staff to instead say Chablis, let's say Styria in Austria, and let's let that be our cornerstone. And it requires a lot of education. It requires a lot of communication. It requires a lot of checking in with ourselves, because sometimes people don't want to have the conversation, and that is totally okay. So I can say less, like, this is what you want, bet, here you go. Walk away, drop my knives, like, it's fine. But I think when we're talking about how we're describing wine, when we're talking about how to pitch this to people, accessibility is so important. And your language, you need to make sure that your most vulnerable population is catered to, because then everyone else will be as well, right? It'll spiral upwards. So if I can use words that are easily understood, if I can use things that are clear and concise but evocative of something, I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to push you a little bit and say, okay, I get that Chablis is your favorite. Can I show you maybe your new favorite? And so that way, it's a seed that's planted. It's growth that's being offered to them, because then maybe next time they go somewhere and they say, oh, I actually really like Styrian wine. And so suddenly they're not relying on Chablis as their cornerstone, because like France who? Right? Like at the end of the day, if we're talking about like history, if we're talking about genesis of things, like I'm bored. I want to move us past that. And so it's a little bit of backwards movement to go forward. You have to be really patient with the process. I think you have to be very respectful of the process and understand that it's not going to happen all at once. But if I can be a liaison for these wines, if I can be the vessel that then is used to have this conversation and inspire these thoughts, then I'd say I'm being successful, even if it's that one moment of record scratch of like, what am I gonna say? What am I gonna use as my reference? If I've inspired you to change that reference point, well, then you're already on that journey, and then I hope you'll continue on that journey. And it's a nonlinear pathway. Like, you'll get there when you get there, but also what is there anyway? The conversation is going to continue to expand. So it's not linear. Once again, I don't know if I answered the question.
No, you're doing fantastically. No, this is great. And so actually, I want to go, and either of you can take this, both of you can, but like, I think, especially because of the background of WSET or whatever, like, because I know, like, yeah, I'm going through diploma right now. I don't know why I am still, but I'm doing it. But I know, like, I've always struggled with, you know, kind of like the classifications, the grid and all of that. And we've had many conversations about this, you know, for a long time. But I wonder, like, has, you know, of all that study, like, has it helped or hindered you in terms of like how you're approaching, you know, this frontier in you know, talking to people about it, especially people that are coming from that background too, right? Because I know, like, I feel having conversations about hybrids with you know, court people and with certain, you know, WSET people, it is like literally banging my head against a wall. So I would wonder if it's the same for you or different, or do you find that it helps you, it gives you a little bit more versatility?
I wanted to field first because I have a shorter answer, and then I can't wait to hear Christy's answer. But my shorter answer is that what I have found through the certification programs is that you get out of it what you want to get out of it. So if you approach those programs as it's be all end all and it's everything for you, you're gonna hit a ceiling. In your development as a professional, you'll hit the ceiling of those letters behind your name, and that's it. That's the end of your book. But if you approach those studies as a foundation and a jumping off point, then for me, it worked really well as that, because I constantly ask why. But why? Why is it done that way? Why do people make that choice? Why are consumers making this choice? Why does something cost what it costs? So for me to have a little bit of a foundation underneath my question of why constantly is nice. I appreciate it. It gives me language to use, and this sort of like shared understanding with people that are in that mindset of how wine is made, why it's made, who it's sold to, who's buying it, who's drinking it, all of those sort of facts and figures that, again, I have to use as a jumping off point. And so if I was a more closed-minded person, then I could see myself just kind of shutting it down and being like, I know all I need to know. But it's certainly not that way at all. And so,
Yeah, so I'm supposed to give a long answer. but yeah, I mean, it's a simple, I mean, if given me a test, I'll take it. I love to take tests because I'm good at taking tests. And as an instructor, I find myself reminding students that you're in this room to pass the certification and take this test, and sure, you want to pass it. But I'm constantly reminding them this is just one little section of the world, and here's where we step out of it. Here's where we step out of it. When we talk about winemaking and we talk about, well, hybrids are only for rootstock, I say, well, that's what you need to know for this exam, but let me make sure that you understand there's this whole world out there where if we're going to talk about climate change, if we're going to talk about farming, when we get to the section about farming and different kinds of farming and spraying and trellising and blah, 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 we're talking about the why of that and why do we do these things. We do things a certain way so that there's not rot or there's not downy mildew. Well, if you're using these other grape varieties, you can attack it in a different way. So, I mean, I find in terms of, there was this great presentation that I went to, Pascaline Lepeltier she's starting to do this, the evolution of tasting and expertise, and why the way we talk about wine right now is like 50 years old. It's as old as I am. It's not the end all be all. And she does this great exercise where it's this delicious skin contact wine that is delicious and digestible and everything you want in a wine. And then she says, okay, talk about it using this grid, the WSET grid. And everybody in the room is like, oh crap, I don't know, you can't do it. And it just makes it very, very clear how there's this whole world of taste and wine beyond the grid. But so many people do come into the shop or restaurants or wherever that are coming from that reference point. So in that case, I'm going to meet you wherever you are. And if you're talking about Chardonnay, I'll show you things from that reference point. But at the same side, I've got a staff right now of 2 people up at the shop, and one is brand new to wine, and one has, Stuart, all the classical training in the world. So I'm not going to, I love working with my newbie because she just has such a broad way of approaching it that I'm not going to like force her to go into all of these little boxes just so she can talk about reference points of hybrids in a certain way. So I guess the long answer is it depends. If that's where someone is coming from, I will absolutely find ways to make those matches. I think we all kind of compare and contrast things a lot, but I also like reminding people that those are boxes and let's get out of those boxes.
Cool. Oh my God, those are all, thank you guys so much for those wonderful answers and just, your perspectives. I think I'm sure I can speak for everyone here saying that it's been very, very informative. Also, though, we have like 5 minutes left. I don't know if anyone had any questions. Yes. Should I pass this down around, or do you have a thing? Yeah, pass the other one. All right, cool. To make this truly interactive, we want to hear from you guys. So,
Check. I actually have a question for each of you. This was great. Thank you as well. First for you, do you find yourself using the pandemic as a framework of, when wine almost died in Europe and they started with crafting roots, do you kind of bring that back in? It's like, well, now it's time to do something new. Now it's time to focus on hybrids. We have this climate crisis. And do you ever use that in your education as like, hey, we're in these big cycles? That's the question for you. The question for you is, what is trending with what Willamette Valley producers are picking up as you're putting down, right? Some of them are saying yes. So what do you see? What do you see people investing in? What are they saying yes to? What's making sense for them? And then thirdly for you, this is endless. I'm obsessed. But when you're in this space, right, you're clearly focused on meeting people where they're at and deep hospitality and this change that you'd like to make, we know as lateral thinkers, we cannot address that directly. So I'm curious about what other practices, in your life, because it's not about that, it's about what everything else you do to embody, right? You must have practices where you work on embodying that inviting hospitality, meeting people like that. So I'm curious if you're open to sharing what that looks like for you.
Thank you for the question. I'm trying to be thoughtful in my answer. Okay. To me, hospitality is so tied to romance. I think I'm an incredibly romantic person. And I think that I'm also an incredibly political person. My background is in research in politics and women's studies. I don't think I can divorce that at all from my personality, I'll be honest, in terms of viewing things very critically. And I think that we all have a deep, deep responsibility to each other. And I think that one of the only universal experiences that we all have is that we all have to be fed, right? And we all have to, like for me growing up, we didn't go on vacations as a family, but we went to really nice dinners. And so that to me is so nostalgic. That to me is like my parents' deep form of care for us. So I think that with COVID, I think hospitality professionals are still navigating a deep amount of grief. And I think that it's been really difficult to transmute that into care. But I think that that's what we're constantly being tasked with, is transmuting something that, for myself, what I thought of when it came to the pandemic was like, I'm a native New Yorker. I've never really left. So I thought about every crisis that we've had before in New York. You still went out to dinner, right? It was like, hey, everything's fucking crazy. Mom doesn't have the emotional space. Pop doesn't have the emotional space. All right, get in the car. Come on, we're going to go to dinner. And that amount of community care, because you weren't in isolation. You're in a full dining room of people who also need to be taken care of. So I think your original question was about practices. I think that's my practice in a sense of I want to be there for your celebrations. I want to be there for your mornings. It takes a lot of discipline in my own day-to-day. It takes a lot of debriefing. It takes a lot of ritual. I don't think that I can divorce it from my spiritualism. I don't think that I can divorce it from my desires for the future. So once again, I get so unfocused when I'm asked questions, but I hope that answered what you were looking for.
That was really inspiring.
Yeah, no, we'll just dig up the last two.
Oh, the Willamette Valley, right. Sorry, I'm still with you. So the Willamette Valley is super focused on Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and traditional method sparkling wine, which is great. They're all great. And I have these funny conversations where someone, a grower, a great winemaker will be like, you won't believe this. We planted Pinot Blanc. It's like, oh, okay, great. Or like even Syrah. So as things are warming up a little bit, people are recognizing climate change. Hello, how are you? Nice to meet you. And they're responding in vinifera kind of ways, in these ways of like, okay, maybe we can ripen Grenache. Let's go crazy. But when I think outside the Willamette Valley into the Columbia Gorge, there are some really fun things happening with fruit out there that are because fruit orchards grow next to vineyards. And in the Willamette Valley, especially in the sub-AVAs of the Willamette Valley, like the Dundee Hills or the Yamhill Carlton AVA, there really isn't a lot of mixed planting in terms of when people grow grapes, they're just growing vinifera and they're focused on that. And then there's other types of agriculture around, but not things that cooperate with wine so much. It's things like hazelnuts. And so in the Willamette Valley, it's still a real focus on let's follow that French model of wine. And, but yeah, in other parts of the state where there are just some really fun things happening. So yeah, I would keep an eye on people in the Columbia Gorge, Southern Oregon, and yeah.
All right, and my question was using the pandemic as sort of focusing people on what's new after it. I do that. I mean, for a lot of these co-fermentations, these hybrids, these farming practices that go with them, it's using that as a conversation starter for anybody who is interested in wine in terms of history or farming or community, or anybody that I can remind that's what it's about. It's in a way it's saying this might be new to you, and it's new that we're seeing a lot of it, and that's exciting, but also harkening back to, but these are actually old practices. These are old ways of doing things. So it's a way of kind of being able to look forward and use people's interest in, some recognition that climate change is climating, that this is happening, and we can look forward by looking back. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Sorry, I have to say one more thing about the Willamette Valley, because I was sitting here racking my brain. There is a producer in the Willamette Valley that I just love to talk about because they do really good work with alternatives, and that is Art and Science. So they do co-ferments with fruit and grapes. They do grapes on their own. But anyway, they're really outside of what people expect them to do, and they're right in the heart of the Willamette Valley.
Awesome. We are signing off, but I just again want to thank the Slowly panel. Thank you guys so much. You make my job very easy. And thank all of you for listening, and the people out there that are tuning in virtually. And also thank Jade, because we love her. But thank you guys. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you all for tuning into the seminar. In about 10 minutes, we have Roots, the story, the saga of an American vine, which is going to be amazing. Hope to see you in a few. Thanks.